October 14, 1948, 2:13 a.m., the upper level of the Queensboro Bridge. The 1947 Lincoln Continental came to a screeching halt, rubber burning against the steel grating of the bridge deck. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a cage. Two black Packards blocked the path forward, chrome bumpers gleaming under the sickly yellow street lamps. In the rearview mirror, two more sedans swerved into position, sealing the retreat. 4 cars, 12 men, nowhere to run. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the passenger seat, unmoving. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his eyes scanning the fog rolling off the East River below. The silence that followed the screech of tires was heavier than the steel trusses above them. It was the silence of a tomb. 12 doors opened in unison. 12 men stepped out onto the damp metal of the bridge. They wore fedoras pulled low and trench coats that bulged at the hips. In the center of the forward blockade stood Sal Moretti, a capo from the Genovese family, holding a Thompson submachine gun. He raised the barrel, aiming directly at the Lincoln's windshield. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an execution. The Queensboro Bridge was about to become a coffin suspended 300 feet above the black water. Bumpy didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't scream for his driver to ram them. He simply watched, counting the seconds, waiting for a sound that wouldn't come. 3 weeks earlier, Harlem was a powder keg, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was the spark sitting on top of it. By 1948, Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was the unofficial mayor of Harlem. He moved through the streets like a panther, quiet, lethal, and undeniably regal. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was always the smartest. He read history, philosophy, and law. He played chess while his enemies played checkers. But his intellect terrified the mob families downtown more than his fists ever could. The post-war era brought a shifting tide to New York City's underworld. The Italian Mafia, led by the 5 families, was hungry. They looked at Harlem, specifically the lucrative numbers game or policy racket, and saw a gold mine they didn't control. For decades, the policy banks were the localized economy of Harlem, generating millions of dollars in nickels, dimes, and quarters. The Italians wanted a 60-40th split of every dollar bet on 125th Street. Tensions were at a breaking point. The treaty that had kept the peace since the days of Dutch Schultz was fraying. Every night, the air in the Lenox Lounge on 288 Lenox Avenue was thick with cigar smoke and paranoia. Runners were getting jumped. Collection bags were disappearing. The Genovese family, looking to expand their heroin trafficking routes, viewed Bumpy as the last obstacle between them and total hegemony over uptown Manhattan. The stakes were astronomical. We aren't talking about pocket change, we are talking about an estimated $50 million a year in adjusted inflation. Control of the streets meant control of the unions, the clubs, and the police precincts. The Italians knew they couldn't buy Bumpy Johnson. They knew they couldn't scare him. That left only one option on the table: removal. The instrument of this removal was Salvatore the Butcher Moretti. Moretti wasn't a strategist, he was a hammer, a high-ranking enforcer for the Genovese crime family. Moretti had built a reputation on pure, unadulterated violence. He was known for the Brooklyn solution, making problems disappear into the foundations of construction sites. He had personally overseen the takeover of 3 labor unions in Hell's Kitchen, leaving a trail of broken kneecaps and widows in his wake. Moretti wanted Harlem. More specifically, he wanted the prestige of being the man who took down the Harlem Godfather. He viewed Bumpy's intellectual approach to crime as weakness, a fatal flaw in a business built on blood. Moretti had petitioned the commission for permission to strike, arguing that Johnson was getting too powerful, too organized, and too independent. The threat was palpable. Moretti had a crew of 15 hardened shooters, military-grade surplus weaponry, and the arrogance of a man who believed the color of his skin made him untouchable by the law. He had already sent a message to Bumpy's lieutenant at the ungodly hour of 4 a.m. a week prior, a burning policy slip pinned to the door of the Flash Inn with an ice pick. The ultimatum was clear: surrender the banking centers on 116th Street, or the next slip would be pinned to Bumpy's chest. Moretti wasn't interested in a partnership. He wanted total capitulation. He had the men. He had the Thompsons, and he had the element of surprise. Or so he thought. The setup was designed to be flawless. A fake meeting was arranged in Queens, a sit-down with a supplier who claimed to have a shipment of pure heroin that could undercut the Italians. It was the kind of bait Bumpy would seemingly have to take to maintain his independence. The route back to Harlem required crossing the East River. At 2 a.m., the Queensboro Bridge is a desolate stretch of iron and wind. It is the perfect kill box. The interior of Bumpy's Lincoln smelled of leather and stale ozone. His driver, a man named Red, gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Outside, the fog swirled around the headlights of the blocking cars, creating a ghostly, ethereal glow. The hum of the city was distant, drowned out by the wind whistling through the bridge's suspension cables. At 2:14 a.m., the 12 men advanced. Their footsteps rang out against the metal grate, clack, 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 a rhythmic march of death. They fanned out in a semicircle, blocking both lanes. The sensory details were overwhelming, the metallic taste of adrenaline in the mouth, the visual distortion of the fog, the cold dampness of the river air seeping through the car's vents. Moretti stood 10 feet from the hood of the Lincoln. He smiled, a cold, predatory grimace that showed gold-capped teeth. At 2:15 a.m., Moretti raised his left hand. The signal. 10 Thompson submachine guns and 2 shotguns were raised simultaneously. The black barrels looked like cannon openings in the dim light. The tension in the air was so thick it felt physical, like a heavy wool blanket dropped over the world. Bumpy didn't duck. He didn't flinch. He just watched Moretti's finger tighten on the trigger. At 2:15:30, the order was screamed, "Do it!" The sound that followed should have been the roar of thunder. It should have been the shredding of metal and glass. It should have been the end of a legend. Instead, there was a sound far more terrifying to the men standing on the asphalt. Click, then another. Click-clack. Click, click, click. The silence returned, instant and deafening. Moretti pulled the bolt back on his Thompson and squeezed again. Click. To his left, a gunman racked a shotgun. He pulled the trigger. Nothing but the hollow snap of a firing pin hitting dead air. Panic rippled through the line of assassins. They looked at their weapons, then at each other, confusion warring with a sudden primal fear. 12 guns, 12 jams, 12 failures. The bridge held its breath. The wind seemed to stop. What Moretti didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson didn't play checkers. He played 4D chess. 3 days earlier, Bumpy had walked into a dusty gunsmith shop on 10th Avenue. He didn't go with muscle. He went with an envelope. The shop belonged to the cousin of Moretti's supplier, a man who maintained the family's arsenal. Bumpy knew Moretti was planning a hit. The streets talk, and Bumpy listened to every whisper. He knew they would clean and prep the weapons before a major job. Bumpy hadn't paid the gunsmith to break the guns. That would be too obvious. He paid him to swap the firing pins. Every single Thompson, every shotgun, had been fitted with a firing pin filed down by exactly 2 millimeters. Just enough to look functional, just enough to load a round, but too short to strike the primer. Back on the bridge, the realization hit Moretti like a physical blow. He dropped the useless machine gun. It clattered loudly on the steel grate. Desperate, he reached into his trench coat for his personal sidearm, a snub nose. .38 revolver, the only weapon that hadn't been in the armory cache. He raised the revolver, his hand shaking with rage. He had the shot. He was 6 feet away. The glass wouldn't stop, .38 at this range. The window of the Lincoln rolled down. An electric hum, slow and steady. Bumpy Johnson leaned his head out. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He held a lit cigar. He took a slow drag, the cherry glowing bright red in the darkness, illuminating his calm, impassive face. He blew a cloud of smoke toward the sputtering hitman. Moretti cocked the hammer. "Die, you son of a—" Bumpy spoke. 3 words, calm, measured, deadly. The revolver wavered. Moretti froze. The blood drained from his face. Frank Costello, the boss of bosses. The implication was instant and devastating. If Bumpy was claiming Costello sent him, it meant this wasn't a war between families. It meant Moretti had been set up by his own boss to be wiped out by Bumpy. It meant the jammed guns weren't an accident, they were a sanctioned sacrifice. It was a lie, of course. But in the high-stakes paranoia of the mob, it was a lie that carried the weight of Scripture. Moretti's mind raced. Was he the target? Was this a test? If he pulled the trigger now, would he be killing a man Costello was protecting? Bumpy flicked the ash from his cigar. You can pull that trigger, Sal. But if you do, you aren't just killing me. You're signing your own death warrant with the commission. Think about the pins, Sal. Who had access? The gun lowered, just an inch. But an inch was a mile. At 2:18 a.m., sirens began to wail from the Manhattan side of the bridge. Bumpy had timed this too. A call placed from a payphone in Queens 10 minutes prior, reporting a gangland massacre in progress. The sound of authority broke the spell. Moretti looked at the useless Thompson on the ground, then at the police lights reflecting off the clouds, and finally at Bumpy. The fear in the hitman's eyes was total. He had been outmaneuvered, disarmed, and psychologically dismantled without a single punch being thrown. "Go," Bumpy whispered, dismissing him like an errand boy. The retreat was chaotic. The hitmen scrambled back into their Packards, tires spinning on the wet metal as they peeled away, speeding toward Queens, desperate to escape the trap that hadn't even sprung. Bumpy rolled up the window. "Drive, Red, slow, we aren't running." The aftermath rippled through the underworld by breakfast. The story of the ghost guns of Queensboro spread like wildfire. The narrative wasn't that Bumpy got lucky, it was that Bumpy was magic. He was the man who could turn bullets into water. A sit-down was called 3 days later, not with Moretti, but with the upper echelon of the Genovese family. There was no violence, there were no shouts. Bumpy walked in, laid a file-down firing pin on the table, and the territory dispute was settled. The Italians backed off the 60/40th's demand. They settled for a polite 5% consulting fee to keep the peace, effectively acknowledging Bumpy's sovereignty over Harlem. This night on the Queensboro Bridge cemented Ellsworth Johnson's status as a legend in the history of organized crime. Victories are usually measured in bodies. Bumpy won a war without firing a shot. It demonstrated a level of sophistication that changed the perception of black organized crime figures in America. He wasn't just a thug from the street. He was a grandmaster operating in a world of pawns. The incident reveals the core of Bumpy's philosophy. Violence is a tool of the incompetent. True power is control. Control of information, control of resources, and control of your enemy's mind. He understood that a jammed gun is more terrifying than a firing one because it implies a breach of trust, a betrayal from within. There is a timeless lesson here. Real power isn't about having the biggest stick. It's about preparation. It's about seeing the board 3 moves ahead of your opponent. While they were polishing their guns, Bumpy was studying the mechanics of the lock. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was the smartest man to ever walk the streets of Harlem, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect the code. And tell me in the comments, if you were in that car, would you have kept your cool? Next week, we're diving deep into the time Lucky Luciano tried to take Harlem and failed.